Chapter 13 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 13. What could such men as these raise up in place of the mighty life they had stilled? At first, only chaos. As I went along the waterfront, I felt a confused disappointment. Deep under all my questioning there had been a vague subconscious hope that I would see a miracle here. I had looked for an army. I saw only mobs of angry men. They were picketing the docks, here making furious rushes at men suspected of being scabs, there clustering quickly around some talker or some man who was reading a paper, again drifting up into the streets of teeming foreign quarters, jamming into barrooms, voicing wildest rumors, talking, shouting, pounding tables with huge fists. And to me there was nothing inspiring, but only something terrible here, an appalling force turned loose, sightless and unguided. What a fool I had been to hope! The harbor held no miracles. The strike leaders seemed to have little control. Headquarters were in the wildest disorder. Into the big bare meeting hall and through the rooms adjoining drifted multitudes of men. There were no inner private rooms, and Marsh saw everyone who came. He was constantly shaking hands or drawling casual orders, more like suggestions than commands. I caught sight of Joe Kramer's face at his desk, where he was signing and giving out union cards to a changing throng that kept pressing around him. Joe's face was set and haggard. He had been at that desk all night. It's hopeless. They can do nothing, I thought. But when I came back the next morning I felt a sudden shock of surprise. For in some mysterious fashion a crude order had appeared. The striker throng had poured into the hall, filled all the seats, and then wedged in around the walls. They were silent and attentive now. On the stage sat Marsh and his fellow leaders. Before them, in the first 3 rows of seats, was the Central Committee, a rough parliament sprung up overnight. Each member, I found, had been elected the night before by his district committee. These district bodies had somehow formed in the last 2 days, and in them leaders had arisen. The leaders were here to plan together. The mass was here to make sure they planned right. And watching the deep, rough eagerness on all those silent faces, that vague hope stirred again in my breast. Presently I caught Joe's eye. At once he left his platform seat and came to me in the rear of the hall. "Come on, Bill," he said. "We want you up here." And we made our way up to the platform. There Marsh reached over and gripped my hand. "Hello, Bill. Glad you're with us," he said. I tingled slightly at his tone and at 1,000 friendly eyes that met mine for an instant. Then it was over. The work went on. What they did at first seemed haphazard enough. Reports from the districts were being read with frequent interruptions, petty corrections, and useless discussions that strayed from the point and made me impatient. And yet wide vistas opened here. Telegrams by the dozen were read from labor unions all over the country, from groups of socialists east and west. There were cables from England, Germany, France, from Russia, Poland, Norway, from Italy, Spain, and even Japan. Greetings to our comrades came pouring in from all over the earth. What measureless army of labor was this? All at once the dense mass in the rear would part to let a new body of men march through. These were new strikers to swell the ranks, and at their coming all business would stop. There would be wild cheers and stamping of feet, shrill whistles, pandemonium. Gradually I began to feel what was happening in this hall. That first strike feeling, diffused, shifting, and uncertain, was condensing as in a storm cloud here, swelling, thickening, whirling, attracting swiftly to itself all these floating forces. Here was the first awakening of that mass thought and passion, which, swelling later into full life, was to give me such flashes of insight into the deep buried resources of the common herd of mankind, their resources and their power of vision when they are joined and fused in a mass. Here, in a few hours, the great spirit of the crowd was born. For now the crowd began to question, think, and plan. Ideas were thrown out pell-mell. I found that every plan of action, everything felt and thought and spoken, though it might start from a single man, was at once transformed by the feeling of all, expressed in fragments of speech, in applause, or in loud bursts of laughter, or again by a chilling silence in which an unwelcome thought soon died. The crowd spoke its will through many voices, through men who sprang up and talked hard a few moments, then sat down and were lost to sight, some to rise later again and grow in force of thought and expression, others not to be seen again. They had simply been parts of the crowd, and the crowd had made them rise and speak. On the first day of this Labour Parliament, up rose a stolid Pole. He was no committee man, but simply a member of the throng. "You'll send a spicker to my dock," he said. "Pier 52, East River. I tink he make de boys come out." He sat down, breathing heavily. "You don't need any speaker. Go yourself," an Irishman called from across the hall. "I no speak," said the Pole emphatically. "You're speakin' now, ain't you?" There was a burst of laughter, and the big man's face grew red. "You don't need to talk," the voice went on. "Just go into your dock and yell 'Strike!' You've got chest enough, you Polak." The big Pole made his way out of the hall. In the rear I saw him light his pipe and puff and scowl in a puzzled way. Then he disappeared. The next day, in the midst of some discussion, he rose from another part of the hall. "I want to say I strike my dock," he shouted. Nobody seemed to hear him. It had nothing whatever to do with the subject, but he sat down with a glow of pride. A Norwegian had arisen and was speaking earnestly, but his English was so wonderful that no one could understand. "Shut up, you big Swede, go and learn English," somebody said. "He don't have to shut up." The voice of Marsh cut in, and the mass backed up his curt rebuke by a murmur of approval. He had risen and come forward, and now waited till there was absolute silence. "Everyone gets a hearing here," he said. "We've got 9 nationalities, but each one checks his race at the door. Every man is to have a fair show. What we need is an interpreter. Where's someone who can help this Swede?" There was a quick stirring in the mass, and then a man was shoved out of it. He went over to the speaker, who at once began talking intensely. "The first thing he wants to say," said the interpreter at the end of the torrent, "is that he'd rather be dead than a Swede. He says he's a Norwegian. His second point is that all bad feeling between nationalities ought to be stopped if the strike's to be won. He says he's seen fights already between Irish and Italians." Up leaped an enormous negro docker who sounded as though he preached often on Sundays. "Yes, brothers," he boomed, "let us stop our fights. Let us desist. Let us refrain. We are men from all countries, black and white. The last speaker came from Norway. He came from way up there in the north. My father came from Africa." "He must have come last Monday," said a dry, thin voice from the back of the hall, and there was a laugh. "Brothers," cried the black man, "I come here from the colored race. At my dock I got over 60 Negroes to walk out. Is there no place for us in this strike? If my father was a slave, is my color so against me?" "It ain't your color, it's your scabbing," a sharp voice interrupted. "They broke the last strike with coons like you. They brought you up in boats from the south, and you scabbed yourself. Didn't you? You did. You of a nigger." A little Italian sprang up in reply. He did not look like a docker. He was gaily dressed in a neat blue suit with a bright red tie. "Fellow workers, I am Italian man. You call me Guinea, Dago, Wop. You call another man Coon, nigger. You call another man a Sheeny. Stop calling names. Call men fellow workers. We are on strike. Let us not fight each other. Let us have peace. Let us have a good time. I know a man who has a big boat, and he say now we can have it for nothing, to take our wives and children and make excursions every day. On the boat we will have a good time. I am a musician. I play the violin on a boat till I strike. So now I will get you the music, and we shall run that boat ourselves. We have our own dockers to start it from the dock. We have our own stokers, our own engineers. We have our own pilots. We have all. And it will be easy to steer that boat, for we have made the harbor empty. We shall have the whole place to ourselves. Some day, maybe soon, we have all the boats in the world for ourselves, and we shall be free. All battle boats we shall sink in the sea. We stop all wars. So now we begin. We stop all our fighting. We take out this boat, all our comrades on boards. No coons, no niggers, no sheenies, no wops. Fellow workers, I tell you the name of our boat, the Internationale." The little man's speech was greeted with a sudden roar of applause, for the crowd had seen at once this danger of race hatred and was eager to put it down. The Internationale made her first trip on the following day, and after that her daily cruise became the gala event of the strike. Both decks of the clumsy craft were packed with strikers, their wives and their children, and all up and down the harbor she went. The little Italian and his friends had printed a red pamphlet, "Revolutionary Songs of the Sea," the solos of which he sang on the boat while the rest came in on the chorus. A new kind of chanty-man was he, voicing the wrongs and the fierce revolt and the surging hopes and longings of all the toilers on the sea, while the ship that was run by the workers themselves plowed over a strange new harbor. I watched it one day from the end of a pier. It approached with a swelling volume of song. It drew so near I could see the flushed faces of those who were singing, some with their eyes on their leader's face, others singing out over the water as though they were spreading far and wide the exultant prophecy of that song. It passed. The singing died away, and still I sat there wondering. We shall have all the boats in the world for ourselves, and we shall be free. All battle boats we shall sink in the sea. We stop all wars. So now we begin. Was it indeed a beginning? Was this the opening measure of music that would be heard round the world? My mind rejected the idea. I thought it merest madness. But still that song rang in my ears. What deep compelling force was there? This curious power of the crowd that had so suddenly gripped hold of this simple Italian musician, this fiddler on excursion boats, and in a few short days and nights had made him pour into music the fire of its world-wide dreams. I saw it seize on others. One day a young girl rose up in the hall. A stenographer on one of the docks, she was neatly, rather sprucely dressed, but her face was white and scared. She had never made a speech before. She was speaking now as though impelled by something she could not control. "Comrades, fellow workers?" Her voice trembled violently. She paused and set her teeth, went on. "How about the women and babies?" she asked. "I know of one who was born last night, and that's only one of a lot. We have thousands of kids and old people, sick people too, and cripples and drunks, all that these lovely jobs of ours have left on our backs. They've got to be carried. Who's to take care of 'em, feed 'em, doctor 'em? If we're going to run the earth, let's begin at home. What does anyone know about that?" She sat down with a kind of a gasp of relief. Her seat was close to the platform, and I could see her bright, excited eyes as she listened to what she had started here. For the crowd, as though it had been only waiting for this girl to speak its thought, now seized upon her question. Sharp voices were heard all over the hall. Some said they could get doctors. Others knew of empty stores that could be had for nothing, and used as free food stations. An assistant cook from an ocean liner told where his chief bought wholesale supplies. And the girl who had roused this discussion, her nervousness forgotten now, rose up again and again with so many quick, eager suggestions that when the first relief station was opened that evening, she was one of those placed in charge. I saw her grow amazingly, for now I came to know her well. Her name was Nora Ganey. At home that night, when Eleanore said, "Remember, dear, I want something to do that will let me see the strike for myself," I thought at once of this work of relief. Eleanore would be good at this. She had trained herself in just such work. And it appealed to her at once. She went down with me the next morning, and she and Nora Ganey, though their lives had been so different, yet proved at once to be kindred souls. Eleanore gave half her time to the work, and these two became fast friends. Before the strike, Nora had sat all day in an office pounding a typewriter. Several nights a week she had gone to dances in public halls, and that had made her entire life. In the strike she was at her food station all day, and each evening till late she visited homes, looking into appeals for aid, and if need be, issuing tickets for food. She heard the bitterest stories from wives of harbor victims, and she began telling these stories in speeches. Soon she was sent out over the city to speak at meetings and ask for aid. With Eleanore I went one night to hear this young stenographer speak to 20,000 in Madison Square Garden. And the strike leader who made that speech was not the girl of 2 weeks before. Her life had been as utterly changed as though she had jumped to another world. Through Marsh and Joe, in those tense days, I was fast making striker friends. With some I had long, intimate talks. I ate many kitchen suppers and spent many evenings in tenement homes. But though by degrees I felt myself drawn to these men who called me Bill, when alone with each one I felt little or none of that passion born of the crowd as a whole. With a sharp drop, a sudden reaction, I would feel this new world gone. Its strength and its wide vision would seem like mere illusions now. What could we little pygmies do with the world? Its guidance was for Dillon and all the big men I had known. Often in those days of groping, knotty problems all unsolved, with a sickening hunger I would think of those men at the top, of their keen minds so thoroughly trained, their vast experience in affairs. I would feel myself in a hopeless mob, a dense, heavy jungle of ignorant minds. And groping for a foothold here I would find only chaos. But back we would go into the crowd, and there in a twinkling we would be changed. Once more we were members of the whole and took on its huge personality. And again the vision came to me, the dream of a weary world set free, a world where poverty and pain and all the bitterness they bring might in the end be swept away by this awakening giant here, which day by day assumed for me a personality of its own. Slowly I began to feel what it wanted, what it hated, how it planned, and how it acted. And this to me was a miracle, the one great miracle of the strike. For years I had labored to train myself to concentrate on one man at a time, to shut out all else for weeks on end, to feel this man so vividly that his self came into mine. Now, with the same intensity, I found myself striving day and night to feel not one, but thousands of men, a blurred, bewildering multitude. And slowly in my striving I felt them fuse together into one great being, look at me with two great eyes, speak to me with one deep voice, pour into me with one tremendous burning passion for the freedom of mankind. Was this another God of mine? End of chapter 13. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 14 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 14. The great voice of the crowd, incessant, demanding of me and of all within hearing to throw in our lives, to join in this march to a new free world, regardless of all risk to ourselves, grew clear to me now. I felt myself drawn in with the rest. I was helping in the publicity work. Each day I met with the leaders to draw up statements for the press. And these messages to the outside world that I wrote to the slow and labored dictation of some burly docker comrade, or again by myself at dawn to express the will of a meeting that had lasted half the night, slowly became for me my own. Almost unawares I had taken the habit of asking, how much can we do? How sane and vigilant can we be to keep clear of violence, bloodshed, mobs, and a return to chaos? How long can we hold together fast? How far can we march toward this promised land? In order to see ourselves as a whole and feel our swiftly swelling strength, having now burst the confines of our hall, we began to hold meetings out on the farm. There are many farms on the waterfront, for a farm is simply the open shore space in front of a dock. But this, which was one of the widest of all, now came to be spoken of as the farm, and took on an atmosphere all its own. For there were scenes here which will long endure in the memories of thousands of people. For them it will be a great bright spot in the times gone by, in one of those times behind the times, as this strange world keeps rushing on. From the top of a pile of sand where I stood with the speakers at the end of a soft April day, I saw the whole farm massed solid with people. This mass rose in hummocks and hills of humanity over the piles of brick and sand and of crates and barrels dumped by the trucks, and out over the water they covered the barges and the tugs, and there were even hundreds upon the roofs of dock sheds. The yelp of a dog was heard now and then, and the faint cries of children. But the mass as a whole stood motionless, without a sound. They had stood thus since 2 o'clock, and now the sun was setting. To the west the harbor was empty. No smoke from ships obscured the sun, and it shone with radiant clearness upon 11 races of men, upon Italians, Germans, French, on English, Poles, and Russians, on Negroes and Norwegians, Lascars, Malays, coolies, on figures burly, figures puny, faces white and faces swarthy, yellow, brown, and black. The sun shone upon all alike, except where that Morgan liner, still lying unloaded at her dock, threw a long, dark, creeping shadow out across the throng. 30,000 people were here, 30,000 intensely alive. As I eagerly watched their faces, it was not their poverty now, but their boundless fresh vitality that took hold of me so hard. I had read many radical books of late in my groping for a foothold, and I had found most of them dry affairs. But now the crowd, through its leaders, had laid hold upon the thoughts in these books, had made them its own and so given them life. In the process, the thoughts had been twisted and bent, some parts ignored, and others brought out of all their nice proportions. Exaggeration, sentiment, all kinds of crudity were here. But it was crudity alive. A creed was here in action. Out of all the turmoil, the take and give, the jar and clash back there in the meeting hall, had come certain thoughts and passions, hopes and plans, that the multitude had not ignored or hooted, but had caught up and cheered into life. And these ideas that they had cheered were now being pounded back into their minds. Monotonous repetition, you say? Yes, monotonous repetition, slow sledgehammer blows upon something red-hot, pounding, 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 that when it cooled its shape might be changed. Nora Ganey was speaking. "Look at those ocean liners," she cried. Her voice was sharp and strident. "They're paralyzed now, and because they are, they're costing the big companies millions of dollars every day. That's what their time is worth to their owners. But what are those ships worth to you? $10 a week and a broken arm? Or a leg or a skull? You can take your choice. 6,000 of you men were crippled and crushed to death last year. And that, let me remind you, was only in the port of New York. Why was it? Why did it have to be? And why will it always have to be until you make these ships your own? Because, fellow workers, the time of the ships is worth so much to their owners that the work has got to be rushed day and night. And in that rush, somebody's bound to get hurt. If he isn't killed, he's lucky. And as for the rest, when at last you're through and dead tired, they point to the saloons and say, 'Now have a few drinks. We won't need you again till next Tuesday.' Do you know what all this means in your homes? It means drunks, cripples, sick and poor. It means such sights as I'll never forget. I've seen 'em all, just lately. I never thought of such things before. I liked my office job on the dock and all the jobs around me, and when sailing time drew near, I liked the last excitement. I liked the rich furs and dresses and the cute little earrings and slippers and dogs that were attached to the women who came. I liked to see them pile out of their motors and laugh and make eyes at the men they belonged to. I liked to peep into the cabins they had, get on to all the luxuries there. But out of all this magnificence, friends, and this work that keeps it going, I saw one day a man come on a stretcher. He was dead. And that started me thinking. That's why I came out when the strike was called. And in the strike I've gone into your homes. I've seen what those soft, expensive female dolls and all the work that makes them costs. And I've got a thrill of another kind. It's a thrill that'll last for the rest of my life. And in yours too, fellow workers, for I believe that you'll go right on, that you'll strike and strike and strike again till you make these tenements own these ships, and a life won't be thrown away for a dollar." She stopped sharply and stepped back, and there burst out a frenzy of applause, which died down to be caught up and prolonged and deepened into a steady roar as Marsh came slowly forward. He stood there bareheaded, impassive and quiet, listening to the great voice of the mass. At last he turned to the chairman. The latter picked up a whistle, and at that piercing call to order slowly the cheering began to subside. Faces pressed eagerly closer. Marsh looked all around him. "Fellow workers," he began, "it's hard for a man to be understood when he's talking to men from all over the world." He pointed down to a cluster of Lascars with white turbans on their heads. "You don't understand me. But some of your comrades will give you my speech, for we are all strike brothers here. On the ship there is no flag. On the ship there is no nation. On the ship there is only work. On the ship there are only the workers. For a ship may be equipped with the most powerful engines to drive her. She may have the best brains to direct her course. But the ship can't sail until you go aboard. You're the men who make the ships of use. You're the men who give value to the stock of all the big ship companies. You are the ship industry. And to you the ship industry should belong. I want you now to think of a tombstone. Out in the Atlantic, 2 miles down, they tell me, a big ship is stuck with her bow in the ooze of the ocean floor and her stern 600 feet up in the water. In the cold green light down there she looks like a tombstone, and she is packed with dead people inside. She is there because where she should have had lifeboats, she had French cafes instead, and sun parlors for the ladies. Some of these ladies went down with the ship, and we heard a lot about their screams, but we haven't heard much of the cries for help of the thousands of men who go down every year in rotten old ships upon the seas. Nor have we heard of the millions more who are killed on land, on the railroads, in the mines and mills and stinking slums of cities. But now we've decided that cries like these are to be heard all over the world. For we've only got one life apiece, we're not quite sure of another. And because we do all the work that is done, we want all the life there is to be had. All the life there is to be had. That's what we are striking for. That is our share of the life in this world. And until we get our share, this labor war will have no end. Other wars may come and go, but under them all, on land and sea, this war of ours will go steadily on, will swallow up all other wars, will swallow up in all your minds all hatred of your brother men. For you, they will be workers all. With them you will rise, and the world will be free. When the long stormy din of cheers had little by little died away, Joe Kramer began the last speech of the day. He had eaten and slept little, he had lived on coffee and cigarettes, and there was a strained look in his deep eyes as he rose up lean and gaunt by my side. "I'm here today to speak to the men who work in stokeholes naked," he said. "I'm here to talk of the lives you lead, and the lives that millions before you have led, for a few brief years, and then they have died. For lives in stokeholes are not long. And before I begin, I propose that we stand for a moment with uncovered heads." He looked out over the multitude as though seeing far beyond them, and his voice was as harsh as the look in his eyes. "As a tribute to all the dead stokers," he said. And in a breathless silence the multitude did what he had asked. Joe broke this silence sharply. "Now, for life and the living," he said, "why was it that those men all died? What has the change from sails to steam done to the lives of the men at sea? The old sailor at least had air to breathe. But what you breathe is red-hot gas. I know, because I've been there. There is a gong upon the wall, and when it clangs you heave in coal. And if when it clangs faster you don't quite keep up to its pace, a white light flashes out of the wall, and that light is the chief engineer's way of saying, 'God damn you, keep up those fires down there. Time is money. Who are you?' The old-time sailor lived on deck. He had the winds, the sun, and the stars. But you live down between steel walls, with only the glare of electric lights in which you sleep and eat and sweat. You work at all kinds of irregular hours. For you there is no day or night. You don't know whether the millionaire and his last and loveliest wife are drinking champagne before going to bed in their cabin deluxe above you, or taking their coffee the next day at noon. You don't know about anything way up there, unless you go up as I've seen you do, half out of your senses from the heat, and make a sudden jump for the rail. The cry is heard, "Man overboard!" then shrieks and a chorus of "Oh my gods!" And then somebody says, "It's only a stoker." He stopped short, and at that sudden roar of the crowd I saw him frown and quiver. He drew a deep, slow breath and went on. They threw off all the good in the ship with sails, but they carefully kept all that was bad. The old mutiny laws, they kept all that. Undermanning of crews, they kept all that. The waterfront sharks, they kept all that. But there was one thing they couldn't keep, the old sailor's habit of standing all this. He had run away to sea as a boy. He'd been kicked all his life by the bucko mate into a state where he couldn't kick back. But with you men it is not so. Among all the thousands standing here, most were on shore a few years ago, and you took your land views with you on board. You organized seamen's unions. The one in this country was meek and mild. It did not strike. It went on its knees to Congress instead. And here's part of the written petition it made. We raise our manacled hands in humble supplication, and we pray that the nations of the earth issue a decree for our emancipation, restore us our rights as brother men. But Congress had no ear for you then. Sailors are men who have no votes, and so you failed in your pleading. But in the labor movement there seems to be no such word as fail. You have not given up your union. Instead, you have formed one of a kind more dangerous to your masters. You have not made smaller your requests. No, you are now demanding more. And instead of asking for merciful laws, you are saying, "We are done with your laws. We'll have none of your laws. We'll break your laws when they come in our way." And what do your masters answer? Here are thousands of deserters. Every man here has broken the law by leaving his ship. But have they tried to arrest you? No. They're afraid to arrest 20,000 men. They're afraid of this strike. They're afraid of you. They're so almighty scared downtown that though we've been only a week on strike, they've already sent their commands to their Congress to give us what merciful laws we like. They're scared because we've thrown over their laws, because they know that we now see our power to stop all their ships and the trade of their land and send their stock market into a panic. And now, do you know what I want you to do? I want you to look at their ships, at their docks, at their harbor, men, and laugh. Laugh! Don't you see there's no need of violence? Laugh! In old times the people built barricades. You don't need barricades nor any guns. All you've got to do is stand here and laugh. Look at all you have done to your bosses, and laugh. To this town, to this nation, and laugh, laugh. Look and think of what you can do, all you, and you, and you, and you, just by folding your arms. Think of all you will do, and laugh, 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 laugh. He broke off with both arms raised, and there followed one moment without a sound. Then suddenly, quick and hard and clear, from a corner of this human ocean, I heard a single peal of laughter. In an instant scores joined in. Rising in outbursts here and there, deepening, rushing out over the farm, it gathered and rolled in wave on wave, rising, always rising, and it swelled into such a laugh that I saw the police feel for their clubs. Reporters scrambled for high places, turned their kodaks on it all. Women snatched up their babies in terror and ran. Marsh stepped forward, caught Joe by the arm, and jerked him back to where I was standing. I gripped Joe's hand. It was icy cold. Marsh shouted to the chairman, and the piercing whistle for order was heard. But it took a long time for that laugh to die. Long after the meeting had broken up, I saw groups gather together, and presently they would begin to laugh, and their laughter would take on again that same convulsive tensity. I heard small clusters laughing, and dense throngs in hot saloons where the low rooms would echo and double the roar. Late at night, out on the waterfront under the bow of that Morgan ship, I found two strikers smoking their pipes, and I sat down and lighted mine. One was a Lascar, the other a Pole. In the strike these wanderers over the earth had met on the waterfront under a wagon where each had come to sleep the night. Since then they had become good friends. Each spoke a little English. Each one had caught bits here and there from the speeches made that afternoon, and they had been trying to pool what they'd heard, trying to find why it was they had laughed. As now I tried to give them the gist of what Joe Kramer had said, from time to time they would glance up at the big ship they had paralyzed and chuckle softly to themselves. Then I went on to Marcia's speech, and out there in the darkness I could feel their rough faces, one white and one brown, grow deeply, eagerly intent, as these strike brothers listened to the voice that had spoken the dream of the crowd. Other wars may come and go, but under them all on land and sea this war of ours will go steadily on, will swallow up all other wars, will swallow up in all your minds all hatred of your brother men. For you they will be workers all. With them you will Chapter 15 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 15. To all this, from the buildings far downtown that loomed like tall, grim shadows, the big companies said nothing. But that same night, while I sat talking to those two men, we heard a sharp, excited cry. We saw a man behind us running along the line of saloons. From these and from the tenements came pouring, angry throngs of men. And out of the hubbub I caught the words, "They're bringing in the scabs! By boat!" Past a watchman that I knew, I ran into a dock shed and out to the open end of the dock. And there I saw a weird, ominous scene. Up the empty harbor, under a dark and cloudy sky, came 4 barges, black with negro laborers, and ahead and around and behind them came police boats, throwing their searchlights upon an angry swarm of Union picket dories, from which, as they drew nearer, I heard furious voices shouting, "Scab!" One of the barges docked where I stood, and the negroes quickly slunk inside. I drew back from them as they passed, for to me, too, they were scabs that night. Afraid to face the men outside, whose jobs they had taken, these strikebreakers were to live on the dock under cover of police. Soon half of them lay snoring on long, crowded rows of cots. Food and hot coffee were served to the rest. Then I heard the harsh rattle of winches. I saw these negroes trundling freight. The cargo went swooping up into the ship, and with a deep dismay, a sharp foreboding of trouble ahead, I felt the work of the harbor begun. I heard a quick voice at my elbow. "Say, what the hell are you doing here?" I turned to the Pinkerton man by my side. "I'm reporting the strike." "No, you're not. You're in here to report what you see to the strikers. Now don't let's have any words, my friend. We've seen you in their meeting hall, and we've all got your number. Go on out where you belong." So I went out where I belonged. I went out to the crowd, but I found it changed, split up into furious swarms of men. I found the beginning of chaos here. and the world that I had left behind, the old world of order and rule from above, which I had all but forgotten of late, now sharply made its presence felt. For the God I had once known so well was neither dead nor sleeping. Behind closed doors, the doors that had flown open once to show me every courtesy, it had been silently laying plans and sending forth orders or requests to all those in its service. The next day the newspapers changed their tone. Until now they had given us half the front page. Every statement I had written had been printed, word for word. The reporters had been free to dig columns of human interest stuff out of the rich mine of color here, and they had gone at it hungrily, many with real sympathy. You would have thought the entire press was on the side of the strikers. At times it had almost seemed to me as though the entire country had risen in revolt. But now all this was suddenly stopped, and in its place the front pages were filled with news of a very different kind. "Big companies move at last," were the headlines. "Work of breaking strike begun." The first ship would sail that evening. 3 more would be ready to start the next day, and within a week the big companies hoped to resume the regular service. They regretted the loss to shippers of all the perishable produce which, to the value of millions of dollars, had been rotting away at the docks. They deplored the inconvenience and ruin which had been brought on the innocent public by these bodies of rough, irresponsible men who had openly defied the law. With such men there could be no arbitration, and in fact there was no need. The port would be open inside of a week. So the big companies spoke at last. And as I read the papers at home that day at breakfast, I remembered what Eleanor's father had said. "Don't let yourself forget for 1 minute that the men behind me are going to stamp out this strike." Not without a fight, I thought. But I was anxious and depressed. Dillon had not come of late. He had felt that we wanted to be alone. As now I glanced at Eleanore, whose eyes were intent on the news of the day, I saw with a rush of pity and love how alone she suddenly felt in all this. A moment later she looked up. "Pretty bad, isn't it, dear?" she said. "It doesn't look very fine just now." "Are you going down to the docks?" "Yes, they'll want me," I replied, "to write some answer to this stuff." "Can you wait a few moments?" Eleanore rose. "I'll get on my hat. I promised Nora Ganey I'd run her relief station for her today." I took her a moment in my arms. "You're no quitter, are you?" I said. "We're in this now," she answered just a little breathlessly. "And so, of course, we'll see it through." So we went down together. The waterfront looked different now. In front of the docks where work had begun a large space had been roped off. Inside the rope was an unbroken cordon of police. And without, but pressing close, the multitude of people for whom in a day so much had changed, moved restlessly, no longer sure of its power, no longer sure of anything but a fast rising hatred of the men who had taken their jobs. As at times the police lines tightened and the negroes came out for more freight, thousands of ominous eyes looked on. Standing here at one such time, I saw a negro striker pass. His head was down and he walked quickly, for race feeling had begun. The first ship sailed that evening. Tens of thousands watched her sail, and a bitter voice beside me said, "Laughin' ain't goin' to be enough." Among men on strike there are 2 kinds of attitudes toward those who take their places. The first is the scorn of a man who is winning. "You are a dirty scab," it says. "You're a Judas to the working class, and a thief who is trying to steal my job. But you won't get it. We're bound to win, and you're barely worth kicking out of the way." The second is quite a different feeling. In this is the fear of the man who is losing, and fear, as an English writer has said, is the great mother of violence. You may keep my job. And if you do, I'll be left with nothing to live on. It is this second attitude which is dreaded by strike leaders, for it leads to a loss of all control, to machine guns and defeat. With a deepening uneasiness I saw this feeling now appear. Starting in small groups of men, I saw it spread out over the mass with the speed of a prairie fire. I felt it that afternoon on the farm, changing with the startling speed that sure and mighty giant, the crowd, into a blind, disordered throng, a mottled mass of groups of men angrily discussing the news. Threats against scabs were shouted out. The word scab arose on every side. Bitter things were said against coons, not only scabs, but all of them, God damn 'em. There were hints of violence and open threats of sabotage, things done to dock machinery. But presently, by slow degrees, as though by a deep instinct groping for the giant spirit that had been its life and soul, I felt the crowd now gather itself. Slowly the cries all died away, and all eyes turned to the leader. Facing them with arms upraised, Marsh stood on the speaker's pile, his own face imperturbable, his own voice absolutely sure. "Boys," he said, when silence had come, "one lonesome ship has gone to sea, so badly loaded, they tell me, that she ain't got even a chance in a storm. She was loaded by scabs." A savage storm of boos burst forth. He waited until it subsided, and then continued quietly. "We have no use for scabs, black or white. But we have use for strikers, both black and white. Our negro brothers are with us still, and we'll show them we know that they are our brothers. We're going to stand together. We won't let the bosses split us apart. And when we read the papers tomorrow, we're going to ask if the news is all there. Not the little news in big headlines about a ship or two leaving port, but the big news in a little paragraph, that you have so stopped this nation's trade that now its Congress is demanding that your masters come to terms. And as for this lonesome ship that has sailed, if you want to see just how much that means, go down and look at Wall Street. They say down there, we're all right now, but their market prices say we're all wrong." Suddenly out of the multitude there came a high, clear voice. "You seem to know Wall Street, Brother Marsh. Have you been selling short down there? Who's your private broker?" Instantly there was a rush toward the questioner, but a group of police formed quickly around him, and he was hurried out of the way. "Get after that, Jim. Get after it quick," said Joe by my side. And Marsh lost not a moment. "Let that man go!" he shouted. "He was sent here to try to stir up a riot. That lie was framed up way downtown. But it is a lie, and you all know it. You know how I live and how my wife lives. We don't exactly roll in wealth. But even if I were a crook, or if I were dead, this strike would go on exactly the same, for think a minute and you'll see that whatever has been done in this struggle has been done each time by you. It's you who have decided each point. It's you who have called here today to decide the one big question. Congress has said arbitrate. It's for you all to decide on your answer. This is no one-man union. There is no one man they can fix, nor even a small committee. We're a committee of 50,000 here to make our own laws for ourselves. As you lift up your hands and vote, so it will be decided. But before you do, I want to say this. I care so little for Wall Street, and I am so sure we'll win this strike, that with all the strength I have in me, I beg you to answer. No arbitration. Nothing halfway. All or nothing. If this is your answer, hold up your hands." Up went the hands by thousands. The crowd was all together now, and again it spoke in one great roar. And with a sudden rush of hope I told myself, it's still alive. This fight has only just begun. "That is our answer to Congress," said Marsh, when again quiet had been restored. "That is the law which we have enacted. This strike is to be fought through to the end. We are not to be scared by Wall Street or worked upon by their hired thugs and so resort to violence." "I am not afraid of violence," he continued sharply. "I am here to preach it. But the only violence I preach is the violence of folded arms. You have folded your arms and their ships are dead. No other kind is so deadly as that. Only hold to this kind of violence, and though they may send out a ship here and there, this great port of New York will stay closed, bringing ruin all over the land, till the nation turns to Wall Street and says, 'We cannot wait. You will have to give in.'" As he ended his speech, it seemed to me as though he were reaching far out, gripping that throng and holding it in. But for how long could he hold them? Every paper that they read had suddenly turned against them and prophesied their swift defeat. 2 more ships sailed that night, and as Marsh had foretold, their sailing was played up in pictures and huge headlines, while the statement that I wrote was cut to one small paragraph and put upon the second page. That night, with the eager aid of strikers of 5 nationalities, I wrote a message to the crowd, translated it into German and French, Spanish, Italian, and Polish. A socialist paper loaned us their press, and by noon our message was scattered in leaflets all up and down the waterfront. This message went out daily now. For the greater part of each night I sat in strike headquarters and wrote direct to the tenements. The next day Marsh proposed a parade, and the farm took it up with prompt acclaim. He challenged the mayor of the city to stop it. To friends who came to him later he said, "You tell the mayor that I'm doing my best to give these men something peaceful to do. If he wants to help me, all well and good. If he don't, let him try to stop this parade." And the mayor granted a permit. The next afternoon the Fifth Avenue shops all closed their doors, and over the rich displays in their windows heavy steel shutters were rolled down. The long procession of motors and cabs with their gaily dressed shoppers had disappeared, and in their place was another procession. Men, women, and children, old and young. All around me as I marched I heard an unending torrent of voices speaking many languages, uniting in strange cheers and songs brought from all over the ocean world. Bright-colored turbans bobbed up here and there, for there were no separation of races. All walked together in dense crowds, the whole strike family was here. And listening and watching I felt myself a member now. Behind me came a long line of trucks packed with sick or crippled men. At their head was a black banner on which was painted, "Our Wounded." Behind the wagons a small, cheap band came blaring forth a funeral dirge, and behind the band, upon men's shoulders, came 11 coffins, in which were those dock victims who had died in the last few days. This section had its banner too, and it was marked, "Our Dead." But at one point late in the afternoon some marcher just ahead of me suddenly started to laugh. At first I thought he was simply in fun. But he kept on. Those near him then caught the look on his face, and they all began to laugh with him. Each moment louder, uglier, it swept up the avenue, and it swelled in volume like the menace of some furious beast. The uncontrollable passion I heard filled me again with a sharp foreboding of violence in the crisis ahead. "Why are you here?" I asked myself. "You can't join in a laugh like that. You're no real member of this crowd. Their world is not where you belong." But from somewhere deep inside me a voice rose up in answer. "If the crowd is growing blind, Chapter 16 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 16. 5 more vessels sailed that day, and in the evening Eleanore said, "The women who came to our station today kept asking, why can't they close up the saloons? They're just the places for trouble to start." "We'll try," I said, and that same night Marsh sent word through a friend to the mayor asking him to close all barrooms on the waterfront during the strike. The mayor sent back a refusal. He said he had no power. Late that night I went down the line and found each barroom packed with men who were talking of those ships that had sailed. And they talked of scabs. Speakers I had not heard before were now shouting and pounding the bar with their fists. The papers the next morning ran lurid accounts of these saloons and the open threats of violence there. They censured the mayor for his weakness and called for the militia. Why wait for mobs and bloodshed? To that challenge I heard the reply of the crowd on the farm that afternoon, in their applause of the fiery speech of a swarthy little Spaniard. Francesco Vasco was his name. "They are sending hired murderers who will come here to shoot us down. But when they come," he shouted, "I want you to remember this. A jail cell is no smaller than our holes in the bottoms of their ships. The food is no worse than the scouse we shall eat if we give in and go back to our jobs. And so we shall not be driven back. When the militia come against us, armed with guns and bayonets, then let us go to meet them armed." He stopped short, and from one end to the other of that motionless mass of men there fell a death-like silence. Then he grimly ended his speech. "Armed with patience, courage, and a deep belief in our cause." In the sudden storm of cheers and boos I leaned over to Joe at my side. "Why did you let that man speak?" The frown tightened on Joe's face. "Because he's one of us," he said. 7 more ships had sailed by that night. In front of the dock sheds, outside the double line of police, the throng had grown denser day by day, and each time the scabs came out there had been a burst of imprecations, a fierce pressing forward. The police had repeatedly used their clubs. Now, late in the afternoon, a red hospital ambulance came clanging down the waterfront. It was greeted by triumphant shouts. Some black bastard hurt at last. There was a quick gathering of police, and a lane was formed reaching into the dock. Through this lane drove the ambulance, and as presently it emerged it was greeted by tumultuous cheers. The papers the next morning said that a raging, howling mob had tried to reach the injured man. Cries of "Sabotage!" had been heard. 2 men, they said, had been injured and 1 killed on the docks the day before. Was this sabotage? Had the strikers fixed the winches with the purpose of killing strike-breakers? Why not? Their leaders had openly preached it. Not only the Spaniard, but Marsh himself was quoted as favoring violence, and from that special sabotage issue of Joe Kramer's paper long extracts were reprinted. Were not these 3 leaders responsible for the death of that innocent black man? And should leaders such as these be allowed to go on preaching murder? Put them in jail. Quell this insurrection while still there was time. So spoke the press. The rumor quickly spread about that Marsh and the Spaniard and Joe Kramer were to be arrested that day. All 3 remained at strike headquarters, and a dozen burly strikers kept the throng from pouring in. "Go on home," I could hear them shouting. But far from going, the throng increased until it filled the whole street outside. Suddenly we heard their cries rise into a raging din. "Well, boys," said Marsh, "I guess they're here." He gave a few more sharp directions to his aides and then went out into the hall. A dozen Central Office police in plain clothes were just coming in at the door. "All right," said Marsh. "We're ready. But unless you men were sent here with the idea of starting trouble, suppose you leave here now without us. Each one of us will meet you at any place and time you say." "We can't take your orders, Mr. Marsh." "You mean you were sent here for trouble?" "I mean I have warrants for the arrest of yourself, Joseph Kramer, and Francesco Vasca on a charge of incitement to murder." And in less than a minute I saw Marsh, the Spaniard, and Joe Kramer each handcuffed to two men, one on either side. As they left the hall I came close behind with a score of eager reporters. The crowd, to my excited eyes, was like a crouching tiger now, glaring out of countless eyes. Through the solid mass of men that packed the street from wall to wall, the police had formed a narrow lane from the patrol wagon to the door. On either side of this lane I saw a line of faces, eyes. Some looked anxious, frightened, and were trying to press back. But at the sight of their leaders now with a roar the multitude swept in. In a moment the lane was gone, and some 50 police had formed in a circle around the prisoners. Quickly their clubs rose and fell, and men dropped all around them. But furious hundreds kept rushing in from every side. Women and children caught in the tide were swept helplessly forward, came under the clubs, and went down with the rest, and still the mass poured over them. Now at last the circle of bluecoats was broken. Policemen alone and in small clusters were rushed and whirled this way and that. Outnumbered 20 to 1, they began to go down in the scrimmage. Then I heard a quick shout, "Use your guns!" After that 2 pistol shots, then more in a sharp, steady crackle. The mass began breaking. Out on the edges I could see men starting to run. But down the street came a troop of mounted police on the gallop, and straight through the multitude they rode. I saw the 3 prisoners seized and surrounded and thrown into the wagon. I saw it go rapidly away. The police were now making wholesale arrests. That deep strident roar of the crowd had died down and broken into panting voices. Everywhere were struggling forms. Just before me the throng opened, and I saw a woman at my feet. Her face was bleeding from a club. As I stooped to lift her, I felt a big hand grip my arm, and then a heavy crushing weight pressed down upon my head. I felt myself sink down and down into an empty darkness. When I came to, I was being half pushed and half thrown by police up into one of their wagons. I remember a blurred glimpse of more fighting forms around me. Then a gong clanged and our wagon was off. And in a few moments we had emerged out of all this turbulence into the quiet, commonplace streets of a city of everyday business life. In the wagon a voice began singing. I looked up and saw our Italian musician, the leader of those gay excursions on the Internationale. Now he was singing the song of that name, and as all came in on the chorus, I caught a glimpse of his face. One cheek was bleeding profusely, and with one hand he was keeping the blood from trickling down. With the other hand he was beating time, and his black eyes were blazing. Soon after we came to Jefferson Market and stopped at the entrance of the jail. As we were hustled out of the wagon, and in the stronger light our cuts and swelling bruises came suddenly in view, 2 young girls among us began to laugh hysterically. In a moment we were inside the jail and shoved into a striker group that had come in wagons ahead of ours. A grim old sergeant at the desk was taking down names and addresses and sending the prisoners to their cells. I found myself a cool relief after all that fever of cries. With surprise I noticed it was clean. I had thought all cells were filthy holes. Still in a daze I sat down on my cot and felt the big bruise on my head. Where am I? What has happened? What has all this to do with me? What is it going to mean in my life? I heard a nasal voice from somewhere say, "I know this pen. They're putting the girls with the prostitutes." I heard clanging gongs outside, and soon the banging of steel doors as more prisoners were put into cells. And little by little, through it all, I made out a low, eager murmur. "Say," inquired a drunken old voice, "who are all you damn fools? What is this party, anyhow?" "It is a revolution," a sharp little voice replied. And at that, from all sides, other voices broke out. Then from his cell our musical friend again started up the singing, his strained tenor voice rising high over all. The song rose in volume, grew more intense. "Hey, quit that noise!" a policeman shouted. "Ah, let 'em alone," said another. "They'll soon work it off." But we seemed to be only working it up. Up and up, song followed song, and then short impassioned speeches came out of cells, and there was applause. A voice asked each one of us to name his nationality, and we found we were Americans, Irish, Scotch and Germans, Italians and Norwegians, and 3 of us were Lascars, and 1 of us was a coolie. Then there were cheers for the working class all over the world, and after that a call for more singing. And now, as one of the songs died away, we heard from the woman's part of the jail the young girls singing in reply. And slowly as I listened to those songs that rose and swelled and beat against those walls of steel, I felt once more the presence of that great spirit of the crowd. That spirit will go on, I thought. No jail can stop the thing it feels. And at last, with a deep Chapter 17 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 17. Early in the evening I was taken out to the visitors' room, and there I found Eleanor's father. When he saw me, Dillon smiled. "Do you know where you are?" he asked. "You're not in the Bastille, or even Libby Prison. You're in the Jefferson Market Jail." "It hasn't felt that way," I said. "Probably not, but it is that way, and there's Eleanore to be thought of." "Eleanore will understand." I saw his features tightened. I noticed now that his face was drawn, as though he too had been through a good deal. "Yes," he said, "she understands. But it's a bit tough on her, isn't it? Jail is not quite in her line." I felt my throat contracting. "I know all that. I'm sorry enough, on her account." "Then let's get out of this," he said. "I've brought you bail. No use staying in here all night." "None at all," I agreed. "I want to get back to the waterfront. We're going to issue an answer to this. They'll need me for the writing." Dillon watched me a moment. "You won't be allowed to do that," he said. "They're under martial law down there." I looked at him quickly. "The troops are here?" "Yes," he replied, and there was a pause. "These arrests, this riot," I said a little huskily. "Weren't they all framed up ahead? They needed the riot to get in the troops." "The troops are here." "Rather damnable. Do you think the people on the docks will just sit back and take it all?" "They'll have to," he said gently. "The world's work has been clogged up a little. It's time to go on again now." On the street outside he took my hand. "My boy, when this is over we'll get together, you and I." "All right, when it's over," I said. The farm that night again changed to my eyes. It was now an orderly village of tents. 2 regiments of militia were here, and their sentries reached for a mile to the north, watching the big company's docks. I walked up along the line and had talks with some of the sentries. I remember one in particular, a thin, nervous little man, a shoe clerk in a department store. Every workday for 6 years he had fitted shoes on ladies' feet. He had been doing it all that morning. And now here he was, down on the waterfront, with only the stars above him, and great shadowy spaces all around, out of which at any moment he expected rushes by strikers. These strikers to him were not human, they were foreigners, for the moment gone mad, to be treated very much as mad dogs. And here he was all by himself, his nerves on edge, with a gun in his hands. The absurdity of that gun in his hands! And the serious danger. I went into many tenements, into homes I had come to know in the strike. And they, too, were different now. Their principal leaders taken away and their headquarters closed by the police, the disorganization was complete. That spirit they had relied upon, that strange new spirit of the mass which they had created by coming together, was now dead. And each one felt the weakness of being alone, the weakness of his separate self. Blindly they fought against their despair. I found them packing tenement rooms, gathering instinctively in search of their great friend, the crowd. But from such gatherings as these, the weaker, the more timid and the wiser kept away. Rash spirits led these meetings, and here was the same hot passion that I had felt back in the jail. These people did not want to think. The time for thinking had gone by. They wanted to act, to do something quick. Their minds were fiercely set on the scabs, the police, and the militia. Their strike was not yet lost. Their friends and sympathizers were working hard that very night to get their leaders out on bail. In Washington, a House committee was striving still to compel arbitration. Everywhere the more moderate spirits were drawing together, trying to work out something safe. But these people did not know this. They were in their tenements, they were scattered far apart. They only knew how they had been clubbed, that 3 had been killed and many more wounded, and that now the troops were here. And the more fiery ones among them were feeling only one thing now, that when you are hit, you must hit back. You must show you're not scared. You must show you're a man. And so on the next morning no women and no children but huge silent throngs of men drifted out of the tenements down to the docks and moved slowly along the sentry lines. The chance to show they were not afraid came late in the afternoon. The clear, sweet call of a bugle came floating gaily on the air, then the long, hard roll of drums, and from their camp on the farm the troops came on the double quick up along the waterfront. Now thousands of strikers were running that way. From the foot of a city street across the wide open space to a pier the militia formed in 2 double lines, each line facing outward. Then down that street came mounted police, and behind them a score of trucks loaded with freight. At first I had hopes that the mass would not move. But out of the silence came angry shouts, and those behind pushed forward. Those in front were pressed close up to the sharp lines of bayonets, were prodded savagely by the troops. Militia youngsters, but half-trained, in 2 thin lines opposing what appeared to them a furious sea of faces, fists, and angry cries. No wonder they were nervous. Bricks came flying from all sides, and even heavy paving stones, and then a few pistol shots out of the mass. I saw a militiaman drop on one knee and slowly topple over. I saw an excited young officer shout at his men and wave his sword. I saw long rows of guns make quick, rhythmic movements, then level straight out, and there were 2 long flashes of fire. Disordered throngs were running now. Only a few men here and there turned to fire their pistols or to shout back frenzied, quivering oaths. Behind them a few soldiers were still shooting without orders. Near the sand pile on which I stood I saw a young militiaman, enough like that little shoe clerk to have been his brother. His face was white and his eyes wild. He was panting, pumping his lever, and blindly firing shot after shot. "God damn 'em! Slaughter 'em! Slaughter 'em!" An officer knocked up his gun. That night the waterfront was still. Only the long, slow-moving line of the figures of sentries was to be seen. The troops were back in their camp on the farm. Bivouac fires were burning down there, but up here was only a dark, empty space. Here, scattered about on the pavement, after the firing had ceased, I had seen the dark, inert bodies of men. Most of them had begun to move, until fully half were crawling about. They had been picked up and counted. 39 wounded, 14 dead. These, too, had all been taken away. From the high steel docksheds there came a deep, harsh murmur made up of faint whistles, the rattle of winches, the shouts of the foreman, the heavy jar and crash of crates. A tug puffed smoothly into a slip with 3 barges in her wake. I walked slowly out that way. The tugmen and the bargemen talked in quiet voices as they made fast their craft to the pier. Below them the water was lapping and slapping. The world's work has been clogged up a little. It's to go on again now. The next day 3 heavy battleships steamed sluggishly through the Narrows and came to anchor in the bay. When interviewed by reporters, their commanders were vastly amused. No, they said, the United States Navy was not governed as to its movements by strikes. They simply happened to be here through orders issued weeks ago. But their coming was featured in headlines. I saw something else in the papers that night, a force greater than all battleships. As a week before I had felt a whole country in revolt, I felt now a country of law and order, a whole nation of angry tradesmen impatiently demanding an end to all this foreign anarchy. "We want no more of your strikes," it said. "None of your new crowd spirit. None of your wild talk and dreams. We want no change in this country of ours." The authorities obeyed this will. Bail was denied to Marsh, Vasca, and Joe, and for them a speedy trial was urged. The press now held them responsible not only for that first negro's death, but for all the deaths since their arrest. Let them pay the full penalty. Let them be made an example of. Let this business of anarchy be dealt with and settled once and for all. The work of crushing the strike went on. More troops were brought to the harbor. On the docks there were not only Negroes now. Thousands of immigrant laborers were brought from Ellis Island and put to work at double pay, and on every incoming vessel the stokers were all kept on board. Among the strikers there was a break that swiftly spread and became a stampede. And in the following week the work of the harbor went on as before, with its regular commonplace weekly toll of 100 killed and injured. Peace had come again at last. On Saturday morning of that week I stood on the deck of a ferry boat, packed with little commuters who waved and cheered a huge ocean liner bound for Europe. Lying deep in the water, her hold laden heavy with the products of this teeming land, her decks thronged with travelers with money in their pockets, her band playing, her flags streaming out, and over all on the captain's bridge the officers up there in command, she was a mighty symbol of order and prosperity and of that efficiency which to me had been a religion for so many years. We all followed the great ship with our eyes as, gathering headway, she steamed out past the Statue of Liberty toward the battleships beyond. "Well," said an amused little man close by me, "I guess that'll be about all from the strikers." "Oh, my smiling little citizen, you've only seen the beginning," I thought. What were the strikers thinking now, and what would they be thinking soon? They had wanted easier lives. They had wanted to feel themselves powers here. Caught up in the tide of democracy now sweeping all around the earth, they had wanted to feel themselves running themselves in all this work they were doing. So they had come out on strike and become a crowd, and in the crowd they had suddenly found such strength as they never dreamed could be theirs, and they would not easily forget. The harbor was already seeing to that, for already its work had gone on with a rush, and all its heavy labor was weighing down upon them, like 1,000,000 tons of brick on their chests. I remembered what Joe Kramer had said. It's got so they can't even breathe without thinking. Was the defeat of this one strike the end? The grim battleships answered, "Yes, it is the end." But the restless harbor answered, "No." What change was coming in my life? I did not know. Of one thing only I was sure. The last of my gods, efficiency, whose feet had stood firm on mechanical laws, and in whose head was all the brains of all the big men at the top, had now come tottering crashing down. And in its place a huge new god, whose feet stood deep in poverty, and in whose head were all the dreams of all the toilers of the earth, had called to me with one deep voice, with one tremendous burning. Book 4, Chapter 1 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 1. Once I saw the harbor in a February storm, and in the wind and scurrying snow I saw it altogether like one whirling thing alive. But the next morning the storm had died away, and a wind from the south had brought banks of fog that moved sluggishly low down on the water, dividing the whole region into many separate parts. And from above a dazzling sun shone down upon three objects near me: a ferry-boat, a puffing tug, and a tramp which lay at anchor. Shone so brightly on these three they seemed alone, with nothing but mist all about them. So it was now for a time with me. The strike, which had so suddenly drawn me into its whirling crowd life, now as suddenly dropped away, and personal troubles piled one on the other. In place of that mass of thousands, I saw only a few people I loved, and I saw them so intensely that for a time we were quite alone, with nothing but mist all around us. Sue sent for me one morning, and I went over to our house. I was startled by the change in her face. It looked not only tired, it looked so disillusioned, done, so through with all the absorbing ideas and warm enthusiasm that had given it abundant life. "I'm not going to marry Joe Kramer," she said, "and I want you to tell him so." I stared at her blankly. "I'm sorry," I said. "Are you?" There was just a worn shadow of her old smile. "I don't know why I said that," I replied. "My head's rather dull this morning." "All right, sis, I'll tell him." Still I watched her pityingly. Poor old Sue, what a crash in her life. "I'd like you to tell him the whole truth," my sister went on sharply. "Just why I've decided as I have. Don't say it's because of father. When I wanted Joe, Dad didn't count. He was nothing to me but a back number. But I don't want him now. Joe, I mean. I don't love him any more." If I went to him today in his cell and said I'd stick by him no matter what happened because he was the man I loved, I'd be lying. That wouldn't be me. The real me is a much smaller person than that. I don't love Joe because I've been scared, because he's in a common jail, waiting to be tried for murder." Her face contracted slightly. "I suppose it's the way I've been brought up. But Sue—" "Don't stop me, Billy. Let me talk." And she talked on intensively, so absorbed in this fierce, impulsive confession that she seemed to forget I was there. "I've been thinking what's to become of me. I've been thinking about all the things I've been in, and none seem real any longer. I wanted a thrill, and I got it. That's all. Then I met Joe, and I got it again. I got a thrill out of all his life and the big things it was made of. I got a great thrill out of the strike. Don't you remember how I talked 3 weeks ago when you were here? Dad was the old, and I was the new. I saw everything beginning. I read Walt Whitman's Open Road, and I felt like Joe's camarado. Well, and I kept on like that. And like a little idiot, I couldn't keep it to myself. I went and told some of my friends. That's what's really the hardest now, what hurts the most. I told my friends. I posed as a Joan of Arc. I was going to marry, give up everything, chuck myself into this fight for the people, into revolution. Thrills, I tell you, thrills and thrills. But then Joe got arrested. I knew he was in a cell in the Tombs, in Murderers' Row, and that drove all the thrills away. That was real. Dad made it worse. He talked about the coming trial, Sing Sing, and the death house there. One morning he tried to read to me an account of an execution. I ran away, but I came back and read it myself. I read all the hideous details right up to the iron chair. And just because there was a chance of Joe's being like that, all at once, I stopped loving him. Not just because I was frightened. It wasn't so simple as a scare. It was something inside of me shuddering and saying, "How revolting!" I tried to shake it out of me. I tried to keep on loving him, but I couldn't shake it out of me. Joe had become revolting too. It's because of the way I've been brought up and because of the way I've always lived. I can't stand what's real if it's ugly. It's me. She broke off and looked down. I came and sat beside her and took her cold, quivering hands in mine. "I guess I am sorry, Sue, old girl." "Don't be," she retorted. "I'm too sorry for myself as it is. That's another part of me." Again she broke off with a hard little laugh. "Let's forget me for a minute. What has this sweet strike done to you?" "I'm not sure yet," I answered. "Where is Dad?" "Up in his room." "Tell me about him," I said. Sue drew an anxious little breath. "Oh, Billy, he's been getting so queer. It has all been such a strain on his mind. Every day he kept reading the news of the strike, and some days he would stamp and rage about till I was afraid to be with him. He talked about that death cell until I thought that I'd go mad. Sometimes when we were talking I thought that we both had gone mad." I went upstairs and found him in a chair by the window. With unnatural, clumsy motions he rose and came to meet me. "I'm all right, my boy." His voice had a mumbling quality, and I noticed the strangeness in his eyes. "I'm all right. I'm glad to see you." Then his face clouded and hardened a little, and he tried to speak to me sternly. "I'm glad you've come clean out of that strike and its notions. Glad you've come to your senses," he said. "You're lucky in having such a wife. She's been over here often lately, and she's worth a dozen like you and Sue. Have you seen Sue?" "Yes." "Well, she's all right." I said nothing to this, and he shot a sidelong look at me. "I had quite a time, my boy. I had to keep right at her. Another quick look. I suppose she's told you how I went at her. Never mind, Dad. It's over now. I had to make her feel the noose, I mean the chair, he went on in those thick, mumbling tones, and that she'd have to choose between that and a decent Christian home, like the home her mother had. She was a wonderful woman, your mother. He wandered off abruptly. If she'd only understood me, seen what it was I was trying to do, for American shipping, Yankee sails. He sank down in his chair, exhausted, and I noticed he was breathing hard. I'm all right, my boy. I'm quite all right. With a sudden rush of pity and of love and deep alarm, I bent gently over him. Of course you are. Why, Dad, old boy, just take it easy. Quiet, you know. We're going to pull right out of this. The tears welled suddenly up in his eyes. I'm lonely, boy. I'm glad you're here. Presently I went down to Sue. When is the doctor coming next? Not till this afternoon, she said. I'll be home tonight for supper. Phone me what he says. All right. Where are you going now? To Joe? Yes, sis, I said. She turned and went quickly out of the room. In the Tombs, when Joe was brought out to me, I saw that he, too, had been through a deep change. He had been quiet enough all through the strike, except for that one big speech of his, but he had been tensely quiet. Now the tension appeared to be gone. He seemed wrapped up in thoughts of his own. "Have you seen Sue?" he asked me at once. "Yes, Joe. I've just been with her." "What did she say?" I began to tell him. "I knew it," he interrupted me. "I made up my mind to this the first night I spent here in my cell. It couldn't have happened, it wouldn't have worked. Tell her I understand all about it. Tell her that I'm sure she's right. Tell her it's funny, but it's true. Tell her this infernal pen has worked the same way on me as on her. I mean, it has made me not want her now. I feel sorry for her, and that's all. Deeply and infernally sorry. I was a fool to have let her into it. My only excuse for being so blind was that damned fever that left me so weak. At any other time I would have seen what a farce it was. I wasn't booked for a life like that. It doesn't fit in with this job of mine." He smiled a little bitterly. "I used to say," he continued, "that if I had time I'd like to do something yellow enough so that I'd be cut off for life from any chance of church bells. And I guess I've done it this time. No danger of getting respectable now." "How do you look at this, Joe?" I asked him. "What do you think they'll do to you?" "I don't know." Again he smiled slightly and wearily. "And I can't say I care a damn. I feel like those fellows over in Russia, the revolutionist chaps I met, who didn't know if they'd croak in a month and didn't care one way or the other. But as a matter of fact," he added, "I think this time it's mainly bluff. They wanted to get us away from the crowd and keep us away while they broke the strike. Now that it's over, you'll probably find they'll let us all off with light sentences. Of course the murder charge can't hold. By the way," he added, smiling, "I hear they got you too." "Yes," I answered, smiling back. "The judge fined me $10 and let me go. He said he hoped this would be a lesson." Joe looked at me curiously. "How much of a lesson, kid, do you think this strike has been to you?" "Quite a big one, Joe," I said. "What are you going to do about it?" "I haven't decided." "How is Eleanore taking it all?" "She's not saying much, and neither am I. We're both doing some thinking before we talk." "You're quite a pair," J.K. remarked. "I shouldn't wonder if you nose along quite a distance before you get through. I mean, in our direction." "That's what we're thinking about," I replied. Again he turned to me curiously. "You two can think together, without talking, can't you?" "Yes, sometimes we can." I never got that far with Sue. All at once he came closer, his whole manner changed. "Say, Bill, tell her all I've said, will you? I'm sorry, honest Injun. Make her feel how damnably sorry I am that I ever let her in for this." When I left him I went off for a walk, for I wanted to be alone a while. I wondered just how sure Joe felt about his fast approaching trial. It seemed to me that he Chapter 2 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 2. That evening I learned that my father was worse, and I spent the next day by his bedside. He had had a stroke in the morning and was not expected to live through the night. I found him mumbling fast to himself and making slight, restless efforts to move. At last he grew quiet, and presently his half-opened, gnarled right hand came groping out over the covers. I took it in mine, and at once I felt it close on mine with a quick, convulsive strength. His hand was moist, his eyes saw nothing. I sat there thus for a long time. Then suddenly, "Good boy," he muttered thickly. "Good boy, good. Always good to your mother." He kept repeating this over and over, with pauses between, then again with an effort, fiercely, as though from a distance his mind were set on getting this message over to me, over from an age that was dying into an age that was coming to life, a last good-bye to hold me back. Soon he was only mumbling figures, names of ships in distant ports, freight consignments. Now and then his finger would go to his lips as he turned phantom pages in feverish haste. Again in gasping whispers he would break out into arguments for the protection of Yankee sails. "Protection," he would whisper. "Damn fools not to see it. Discriminating tariffs, subsidies, a navy. Don't forget the navy. Remember War of 1812. Nothing without fighting." Nothing without fighting. He had been learning this all his life, and after he had said it now, he stopped speaking and grew still. Little by little his movements grew weaker. Finally he lay like a log, and the doctor said he would be so until dead. I went up to my old bedroom and sat down by the open window. It was such a beautiful night. From the garden below, where long ago I had felt such shivers over the ocean and heathen lands, a graceful poplar rose. Behind it from the river the huge, dim funnel of a steamer rose over the roof of the warehouse. Overhead to the right swept the great bridge of my childhood. But behind it were other bridges now, and off across the river the buildings of Manhattan loomed in loftier masses to their apex in the Tower of Lights. How changed it all was since I was a boy, and yet how like. On the harbor still the hurrying lights, yellow, blue, and green and red. The same deep, restless hum of labor. And from the waterfront below the same puffs and coughs of engines, the same sharp toots and treble pantings, the same raucous whine of wheels. There came a rough salt breeze from the sea, and it made me think of billowy sails and the days of my father's boundless youth, and of the harbor of long ago that had so gripped and molded him, as I felt mine now molding me. And for what? I asked. To what were we both adventuring out of these little harbors of ours? Toward dawn a tramp came down the river. Dimly as she passed below I could see how old she was, how worn and battered by the waves. a desolate and lonely craft, the smoke draggled out of her funnel. I watched her steam into the upper bay and pass around Governor's Island. I watched till in the first raw light of day I could see only her smoke through the Narrows. Then even this became but a blur, which crept away in that strange dawn light out into the wide ocean. A few hours later my father died. One by one, from different parts of the port, the queerest old men came into our house on the day of my father's funeral, men who still believed in American ships, still thrilled to the dream of the Stars and Stripes wherever there is an ocean breeze, men who still believed in ships that had sails and moved along with the force of the winds, who still believed that cabin boys could rise by the sheer force of their wills to be powers in the ocean world, men who had for the common crowd only the iron discipline, the old brute tyranny of the sea. These strange old men stood with their white heads bowed, a little group, looking down into my father's grave. "He was a magnificent fighter," I heard one of them say as we left. "He wrecked his own business for what he believed in. How many of us would go that far?" From the grave Sue came to our apartment. Eleanore had packed her trunk. "Sue must keep out of that dreary old house," she told me. "Luckily she has a friend out of town whom she's going to visit. When she comes back we must have the house closed, and I hope she'll live with us for a while." We talked of this that evening, for Sue seemed to want to talk. We stayed up until late and planned and planned. Many different kinds of work for Sue were taken up and discussed by us all. She surprised me by the brave effort she made. "I've got to want something, that's sure," she said. "I can't just yet. I've wanted so many things so hard, one after the other for nearly 8 years, that now I feel as though I've used up all the wanting that I've got. But of course I haven't. If I have, I'm a back number, and I'd a great deal rather be dead. So don't you people worry. Depend upon it, in less than a year I'll be all wrapped up in something new. I'll be tremendously enthused," she ended, smiling wearily. She agreed with me that the old house be sold, and after she had left us I made every effort to sell it at once. I found it was heavily mortgaged now, but when at last I made a sale there was enough to clear off all debts and leave about $2,000 for Sue. She would have at least something to start on. As we set about to dismantle the house, various things quickly covered with dust came out of the closets, drawers, and shelves. And these objects brought near again to me my mother's life and that hunger of hers for the things that were fine, that hospitable door which had waited for friends from the handsome old homes all around us. These homes all along the street had now lost their quiet dignity. Some were empty and marked "for sale." Others that had already been sold were cheerless boarding houses. The most handsome home of all, with its ample yard where I used to play, was gone, and in its place rose an apartment building which made the old houses all seem like dwarfs. Her world and his were both slipping away. Her life and his, her creed and his were little now but memories, memories which in Sue and in me must take their chance with the warm new feelings, the cravings, hopes, loves, doubts and dreams of this absorbing world of our own. For the harbor was still molding lives. Chapter 3 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 3. But Eleanore had good reason. When at last the house had been closed, back at home one evening, she told me what she had known for weeks, but had kept to herself until I should be free from other things. We were to have another child. The news was a shock. It frightened me. "Where's the money to come from?" flashed into my mind. In an instant it had passed, and I was holding her tight in my arms. She must have caught that look in my face, for I could feel her trembling. "The same funny old world, my dearest one," she whispered, "with its same old trick of starting out. But oh, my dear, in spite of it all, or because of it all, how good it is to be alive! More than ever, 100 times." "You darling girl," I whispered back. "You're the bravest one of all." Her father came to us the next night, and after Eleanore went to bed he and I talked long together. He looked worn and tired, but the same quiet affection was in his eyes. "Let's see where we are," he said, "and what we've got to go on. To begin with, thank God, you and I are still friends. Then there's Eleanore and your small son and the smaller one that's coming. We're just starting in on a long, hot summer. She must of course be got out of town. How much have you in the bank?" $37, I said. He looked thoughtfully at his cigar. "You've never yet taken money from me," he continued, after a moment. "Still, you'll do it if you had to, because this is our affair. But unluckily just at present I'm nearly as high and dry as yourself. The men who have backed my harbor work have lost so heavily in the strike that they feel now they must recoup. I've already proposed to them a plan which they have as good as accepted. They'll provide enough money to pay the rent of a smaller office. I can borrow enough to pay half my men. The rest I'll have to let go for a time." "And your salary?" I ventured. "Is left out," he answered. "I mean, it is if I can stay here. I want to stay here. I want to put through this job if I can. You see, it has taken 6 years of my life. And besides," he added wistfully, "in a very few weeks they'll finish the work at Panama, and the ships of the world will begin to crowd into a harbor that isn't ready here. We haven't even completed our plans. It's not a good time to stop our work. But of course, if you and Eleanore get into a hole that is serious, as I said before and you'll agree, you'd have to let me help you, even if to do it I should have to give up my work for a while and take up something that will pay." "No, sir." "Yes, sir," he replied, "unless you can earn enough money yourself." We looked at each other a moment. "You know how to bring pressure, don't you?" I said. "Yes, I'm bringing pressure. I want to see you go on as before." "That won't be easy," I remarked. "Shall we talk it over a little?" "Yes." "All right," he said. "Since that talk we had together the day Eleanor's first child was born, what a splendid start you made in your writing. You were not only earning big pay, you were doing fine work, work that was leading somewhere. I could see you learning to use your tools, getting a broad, sane view of life and of yourself, training yourself and building yourself. You were right on the threshold of big results. But then your friend Kramer came along. He had not built himself, he had chucked himself over, neglected himself, his health included. So he took typhoid and came to your home. His being there was a drain on your pocket and a heavy strain on your nerves. He got you unsettled. Then came the strike. And what has it done? It has taken your time, health and money. It has left 2 good workmen stranded, you and me. And I don't see that it's done the crowd any good. What has the strike given you in return for all it has taken away?" "A deeper view of life," I said. "I saw something in that strike so much bigger than Marsh or Joe or that crude organization of theirs. Something deep down in the people themselves that rises up out of each one of them the minute they get together. And I believe that power has such possibilities that when it comes into full life, not all the police and battleships and armies on earth can stop it." The look in Dillon's eyes was more anxious than impatient. "Billy," he said, "I've lived a good deal closer than you have to the big jobs of this world. And I know those jobs are to get still bigger, even more complex. They're to require even bigger men." I smiled a bit impatiently. "Still the one man in a million," I said. "Yes," said Dillon. "His day isn't over. It has only just begun. He may have his bad points, I'll admit he has, but compared to all the little men, his vision is wide and it goes deep. And if they'll only leave him alone and give him a chance, he'll take me and the other engineers and the chemists and doctors and lawyers, and he'll make a world, he's doing it now, where ignorance and poverty will in time be wiped completely out." "They're not going to leave him alone," I said. "I'm sure of that now. Whether he grafts or whether he's honest won't make any difference. The crowd is going to pull him down. Because it's not democracy. The trouble with all your big men at the top is that they're trying to do for the crowd what the crowd wants to do for itself. And it may not do it half so well, but all the time it will be learning, gathering closer every year, and getting a spirit compared to which your whole clean, clear efficiency world is only cold and empty." He must have caught the look in my eyes. "You're thinking that I'm getting old," he said softly. "I and all the men like me who have been building up this country. You're thinking that we're all following on after your father into the past." As I looked back, I felt suddenly humble. Dillon's voice grew appealing and kind. "But you belong with us, Billy," he said. "It was under us you won your start. And what I want now," he added, "is not only for Eleanor's sake, but your own. I want you to try to write again about all the work we are doing, and see what it will do for you. Why not give it another chance? You're not afraid of it, are you?" "No," I said, "I'm not afraid, and I'll give it another chance if you like. I don't want to be narrow about it, God knows, but before I tackle anything else, I'll finish my story of the strike." "All right," he agreed. "That's all I ask. Now suppose you take Eleanor up to the mountains and write your strike article up there. Let me loan you a little just at the start." "How much money have you in the bank?" "Enough to send Eleanor where she belongs." "Eleanor belongs right here," said a voice from the other room, and presently Eleanor appeared. She surveyed us both with a scorn in her eyes that made us quake a little. "I never heard," she went on calmly, "of anything quite so idiotic. Go home, Dad, and go to bed, and please drop this insane idea that I'm afraid of July in New York or of August or September. Do you know what you're going to do tomorrow, both of you poor foolish boys? You're going sensibly to work and worry about nothing at all. And tomorrow night we're all three of us going to forget how it feels to work or think, and get on an open trolley and go down and hear Harry Lauder. Thank heaven he happens to be in town. To hear you talk you'd think the whole American people had forgotten how to laugh. Now, Billy," she ended smoothly, "go to the icebox and get 2 bottles of nice cool beer. And make Chapter 4 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 4. The next day and the next evening Eleanor's program was carried out. But after that night the laughing stopped, for Joe Kramer was coming to trial. I had not seen Joe for over 2 weeks, and I had taken his view of his case, that there was no serious danger. But now I learned from a good source that Joe and both his colleagues were to be brought to trial at once, while the public feeling was still hot against them. As the time of the trials drew near, every paper in town took up the cry. Let these men be settled once and for all, they demanded. Let them not be set free for other strikes, for wholesale murder and pillage. Let them pay the full penalty for their crimes. In the face of this storm, I found myself on Joe's defense committee, the best part of my time each day and evening taken up with raising money, helping to find witnesses, and doing the press work for parades and big mass meetings of labor. Through this work in odd hours I finished my story of the strike. It all came back to me vividly now, and I tried to tell what I had seen. I took it to my editor. "Print that?" he said when he'd read it. "You're mad." "It's the truth," I remarked. "As you see it," he said. "And you've seen it only from one side. If this story had been written and signed by Marsh or your friend Kramer, we might have run it, with a reply from the companies. But I don't want to see you stand for this, in our magazine or anywhere else. It means too much to you as a writer. Look out, my boy," he added with a return to the brusque kindliness which he had always shown me in the years I had worked under him. "We think a lot of you in this office. For God's sake, don't lose your head. Don't be one more good reporter spoiled." I took my story of the strike to every editor I knew, and it was rejected by each in turn. They thought it all on the side of the crowd, an open plea for revolution. Then I took it to Joe in the Tombs. "Will you sign this, Joe?" I asked when he had read it. "No," he replied. "It's too damn mild. You've given too much to the other side. All these bouquets to efficiency, and all this about the weak points of the crowd. The average stoker reading this would think that the revolution won't come till we are all white-haired." "I don't believe it will," I said. "I know you don't. That's why you're no good to us," he said. "We want our stuff written by men who are sure that a big revolution is just ahead, men who are certain that a strike, to take in half the civilized world, is coming in the next 10 years. "I don't believe that." "I know. You can't. You're still too soaked in the point of view of your efficiency father-in-law. So you don't feel you can sign this?" "No." That day I sent my story to a small magazine in New England, which from the time of the Civil War had retained its traditions of breadth of view. Within a week the editor wrote that he would be glad to publish it. "Our modest honorarium will follow shortly," he said at the end. The modest honorarium did. Meanwhile I had sent him a sketch of Nora Ganey which I had written just after the strike. I received a letter equally kind, and another honorarium. I began to see a future of modest honoraria. In the meantime, to meet our expenses at home, I had borrowed money and given my note, and the note would soon fall due. Those were far from pleasant days. On the one side, Joe in his cell waiting to be tried for his life, on the other, Eleanore at home waiting for a new life to be born. By a lucky chance for me, Joe's trial was again postponed, so I could return to my own affairs. I had to have some money quick. I went back to my magazine editor and asked for a job in his office. "I'm ready now to be sane," I said. "Glad to hear it," he replied. "I'll give you a steady, routine job where you can grind till you get yourself right." "Till I get back where I was, you mean?" "Yes, if you can," he answered. I went for a walk that afternoon to think over the proposition he'd made. "I have seen 3 harbors," I said to myself. My father's harbor, which is now dead, Dillon's harbor of big companies, which is very much alive, and Joe Kramer's harbor, which is struggling to be born. It's an interesting age to live in. I should like to write the truth as I see it about each kind of harbor. But I need the money. My wife is going to have a child. So I'll take that steady position and try to grind part of the truth away. "What have you been doing?" Eleanore asked when I came home. "You look like a ghost." "Not at all," I replied. "I've been getting a job." "Tell me about it." I told her part. She went and got her sewing and settled herself comfortably for a quiet evening's work. Eleanore loved baby clothes. "Now, begin again and tell me all," she ordered, and she persisted until I did. "It won't do," she said when I had finished. "It will do," I replied decidedly. "It's the best thing in sight. It will see us through till the baby is born. After all, it's only for a year." "It's a mighty important year for you, my love," said Eleanore. She thoughtfully held up and surveyed a tiny infant's nightgown. "If you do this, you'll be giving up. It's not writing your best. It's giving up what you think is the truth. And that's a bad habit to get into. It's settled now. Please leave it alone." "Oh, very well," she said placidly. "Let's talk of what I've been doing." "What you've been doing?" "Precisely. I've taken a little apartment downtown, over by the river. The rent is $28 a month. It's on the top floor and has plenty of air, and there's a nice roof for hot summer evenings. You're to carry 2 wicker chairs up there each night after supper." "I'll do nothing of the kind," I rejoined indignantly. "You're going to pack up at once and go to the mountains. And when you come back, you're coming right here." "Oh, no, I'm not," she answered. "Don't be an idiot, Eleanore. Think of moving out of here now, in your condition." "It's better than moving out of your work. Dad has kept right on with his, even when they stopped his pay. Well, now they've stopped your pay, that's all, and we've got to do the best we can. We've simply got to live for a while on modest honorariums. Now, don't talk, wait till I get through. You've got to work harder than ever before, but for much less money. But with less money than before, we're going to be happier than we've ever been in all our lives. And you can't do a thing to stop it. If you do take that office work and bring a lot of money home, do you know what I'll do? I'll move to that little flat just the same, and all the extra money you bring will go to Mrs. Bealey." "Who in God's name is Mrs. Bealey?" "One of my oldest charity cases. She was here this afternoon. The trouble with you is, my dear," my wife continued smoothly, "that you've been so wrapped up in your own little changes you haven't given a thought to mine. Well, I've done some changing too. Every time that Sue or you have taken up a new idea, I've taken up a Mrs. Bealey. I did the same thing in the strike. I went with Nora Ganey into the very poorest of all the tenements down by the docks. I saw the very worst of it all, and I tried to do what I could to help. But I felt like a drop in the ocean. And that's how I've changed. Things are so wrong in the tenements that big reforms are needed. I don't know what they are, and I'm not sure anyone else does. But I'm sure that if any reforms worth while are to be made, we've got to see just where we are. And that means that quite a number of people, you for instance, have got to tell the truth exactly as they see it. So I'd rather put our money in that and let old Mrs. Bealey forget our address. That's another reason for moving." "There's nothing noble about it at all," she said as she threaded her needle. "I mean to be perfectly comfortable. I saw this coming long ago, and since the strike was over I've spent weeks picking out a nice place where we can get the most for our money. About 30,000 babies, I'm told, are to be born in the city this summer, and their mothers aren't going first to the mountains, or even for a walk in the park. I don't see why I shouldn't be one. As a matter of fact, I won't be one. My baby won't be born until fall, and I'll have a clean, comfortable flat, with one maid instead of a dirty tenement with all the cooking and washing to do. You'll probably find magazines who'll pay enough honorariums to make $100 a month, which is just about 3 times as much as Mrs. Bealey lives on. So that's settled, and we move this week. Chapter 5 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 5. One night about a month later, when we had ensconced ourselves for the evening out on the roof of our new home, where the summer's night was cooled by a slight breeze from the river, our maid came up and told me there was a strange gentleman below. I went down and brought him up. I was deeply pleased and excited, for he was the English novelist whom I most admired these days. He had come to me during the strike, and had been deeply interested in the great crowd spirit I had found. He was going back to England now. "I'm curious," he told me, "to see how much your striker friends have kept of what they got in the strike. What new ideas and points of view? How much are they really changed? That, I should think, is by far the most valuable part of it all." "It's just what I've been trying to find out for myself," I replied. "Really? Will you tell me?" I told him how on docks, on tugs and barges, in bar-rooms and in tenements, I was having talks with various types of men who had been strikers, how I was finding some dull and hopeless, others bitter, but more who simply felt that they had bungled this first attempt and were already looking forward to more and greater struggles. The socialists among them were already hard at work, urging them to carry their strike on into the political field, vote together in one solid mass, and build up a government all their own. Through this ceaseless ferment I had gone in search of some significant characters, incidents, new points of view. I was writing brief sketches of it all. "How do you feel about all this?" the Englishman asked, "before you were drawn into the strike?" And turning from me to Eleanore, "And you?" he added. Gradually he got the stories of our lives. I told how all my life I had been raising up gods to worship, and how the harbor had flowed silently in beneath, undermining each one and bringing it down. "It seems to have such a habit of changing," I ended, "that it won't let a fellow stop." "Lucky people," he answered, smiling, "to have found that out so soon, to have had all this modern life condensed so cosily into your harbor before your eyes, and to have discovered, while you are still young, that life is growth, and growth is change. I believe the age we live in is changing so much faster than any age before it, that a man, if he's to be vital at all, must give up the idea of any fixed creed, in his office, his church, or his home, that if he does not, he will only wear himself out butting his indignant head against what is stronger and probably better than he. But if he does, if he holds himself open to change, and knows that change is his very life, then he can get a serenity which is as much better than that of the monk as living is better than dying." We talked of books being written in England and France, in Germany and Russia, all dealing with deep changes in the views and beliefs and desires of men. "Any man," he said, "who thinks that modern Europe will go smoothly, quietly on, needs a dose of your harbor to open his eyes." He turned to me with a sudden thought. "Why don't you write a book," he asked, "about this harbor you have known?" Eleanore made a quick move in her chair. "That's just what you ought to do!" she exclaimed. "I wonder if I could," I said. "It would be hard to see it now, as it looked at all the different times." "You'll hardly be able to do that," the Englishman answered quietly. "Because to each one of us, I suppose, not only his present but his past is constantly changing to his view. But I wouldn't let that bother you. What would interest me as a reader would be your view of life as you look back upon it to-day, in this present stage of your growth. I was raised in the Alps myself," he went on, "so my picture of life is the mountain path. As I climb and turn now and then to look back, the twisting little path below appears quite different each time. But still I keep on writing, my changing view of the slope behind and of the rising peaks ahead. And now and then by working my hardest, I've felt the greatest joy of writing the truth. As you know, it isn't easy. But year by year I've felt my readers grow in number. I believe they are going to grow and grow, not mine nor yours, but the readers of all the chaps like ourselves, the readers who pick up each new book with the hope that one more fellow has done his best, not to please them, but to please himself, by telling of life as he has seen it, his changing life through his changing eyes." After he left us there was a long silence. Both of us were thinking hard. And as Eleanore looked up to the stars I saw their brightness in her eyes. "Yes," she said at last, I'm sure you'd better take his advice, and write as truthfully as you can the whole story as you see it now, of this strange harbor you have known." Chapter 6 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 6. I began my story of the harbor. Every hour that I could spare from the stories and sketches of tenement life, by which I made a scant living those days, I spent in gathering memories of my long struggle with this place, arranging and selecting and setting them in order for this record of the great life I had seen. But this wide world has many such lives, many heaving forces. And ever since I had been born, while I had been building for myself one after the other these gods of civilization and peace, all unheeded by my eyes, a black shadow had been silently creeping over the whole ocean world. Now from across the water there came the first low grumble of war. Within one short portentous week that grumble had become a roar, and before all the startled peoples had time to realize what was here, vast armies were being rushed over the lands, all Europe was in chaos, and the world was on the eve of the most prodigious change of all. And like the mirror of the world that it had always been to me, the harbor at once reflected this change. Only a little time before, I had seen it almost empty, except for that crude boat of the crowd, the Internationale, with its songs of brotherhood and of a world where wars should cease. Now I saw it jammed with ships from whose masts flew every flag on the seas, and from the men who came ashore I heard of how they had been chased, some fired upon, by battleships. I heard of war upon the seas. I felt my father's world reborn, an ocean world where there was nothing without fighting, and where every nation fought. Ours had already entered the lists, with a loud clamor for ships of our own in which to seize this sudden chance for our share of the trade of the world. The great canal was open at last, and Europe in her turmoil had had not even a moment to look. The east and south lay open to us, rush in and get our share at last, make our nation strong at sea. And while in blind confusion I groped for some new footing here, strove to see what it was going to mean to that fair world of brotherhood which I had seen struggling to be born, suddenly, as though in reply, there came a sharp voice out of the crowd. Joe Kramer came to trial for his life. Before his case went to the jury, Joe rose up and addressed them. And he spoke of war and violence. He spoke of how in times of peace this present system murders men, on ships and docks and railroads, in the mills and down in the mines. And as though these lives were not enough, the powers above in this scramble for theirs for all the profits in the world, all the sweated labor they could wring out of humankind, had now flown at each other's throats, and the blood of the common people was pouring out upon the earth. My comrades over the water, he said, saw this coming years ago. They worked day and night to gather the workers of Europe together against this war that will blacken the world. For that they were called anti-patriots, fiends, men without a country, and some were imprisoned and others were shot. And over here, where in times of peace the number of killed and wounded is over 500,000 a year, for rebelling against this murder they have called me murderer, and have placed me here on trial for my life. And what I want to ask you now is that you take no halfway course. Either send me out of this dock a free man, or up the river to the chair. For this is no year for compromise. Am I a murderer? Yes or no? Decide with your eyes wide open. If you set me free, I shall still rebel. I shall join my comrades over the sea, who already are going about in the camps and saying to the rank and file, "You can stop this slaughter. You can save this world gone mad. You can end this murder, both in time of war and peace." And the jury set Joe free. Early in the following week I went down to his room by the docks for a last evening with him there. Joe was sailing that same night. Under a name not his own he had taken passage in the steerage of the big fast liner which was to sail at 1 o'clock. Into his room all evening poured his revolutionist friends, and the chance of revolution abroad was talked of in cool, practical terms. Nothing could be done, they said, in the first few months to stop this war. Years ago the man in France, who had led the anti-war movement, had predicted that if war broke out, every government rushing in would force on its people the belief that this was no war of aggression, but one of defense of the fatherland from a fierce, onrushing foe. And so, in truth, it had come about, and against that appeal to fight for their homes no voice of reason could stem the tide. The Socialists had been swept on with the rest. By tens and hundreds of thousands they had already gone to the front. But it was upon this very fact that Joe and his friends now rested their hopes. For just so soon as in the camps the first burst of enthusiasm had begun to die away, as the millions in the armies began to grow sick of the sight of blood, the groans and the shrieks of the wounded and dying, the stench of the dead, and themselves, weary of fighting, worn by privation and disease, began to think of their distant homes, their wives and children starving there. Then these Socialists in their midst, one at every bivouac fire, would begin to ask them, "Why is it that we are at war? What good is all this blood to us? Is it to make our toil any lighter, life any brighter in our homes? Or were we sent out by our rulers to die only in order that they, in their scramble, might take more of the earth for themselves? And if this is true, why not rise like men and end this fearful carnage? Already these thousands were in the camps. Into Joe's room that evening came men to give him the names and regiments of those comrades he could trust. Joe, with a few hundred others, was to make his dangerous way into the camps and the barracks, wherever that was possible, of French and Russians and Germans alike, to carry news from one to the other, to make ready, and to plan. Now and then, in the talk that night, I felt the thrilling presence of that rising god, that giant spirit of the crowd, not dead but only sleeping now to gain new strength for what it must do. And again, in gleams and flashes, I saw the vision of the end, the world for all the workers. For in this crowded tenement room, forgotten now by governments, this rough, earnest group of men seemed so sure of this world of theirs, so sure that it was now soon to be born. One by one they went away, and Joe and I were left alone. Slowly he refilled his pipe. I thought of the talks we had had in 10 years. "Well, Bill," he inquired at last, "what are you going to do with yourself?" "Write what I see in the crowd," I said, "from my new point of view, this year's point of view," I added. I went on to tell him what the English writer had said, and I told of my book on the harbor. "Well," said Joe when I was through, "I guess it's about the best you can do. You've got a wife to think of." "You don't know her," I rejoined, and I told him how she had changed our home in order not to stop my work. "But don't you see what she's up to?" said Joe. "What the devil do you mean?" I asked indignantly. Joe blew a pitying puff of smoke. "You poor blind dub of a husband," he said with his old affectionate smile. "She's making you love her all the more. You're anchored worse than ever. You can't go over to Europe and take a chance at being shot. Don't you see the hole you're in? You've got to care what happens to you." "I'm not so sure of that, Joe," I said. "Things in this world are changing so fast that it's hard for any man in it to tell where he'll be in a year from now, or even a few short months from now. It's the year that no man can see beyond." "You mean you're coming over?" he asked. "I'm not sure. Just now I'm going to finish this book. I'm going to see Eleanore through till the baby is born. But after that, if over in Europe the people rise against this war, I don't just see how I can keep out." Joe looked at me queerly, and with a curious gruffness, "I hope you will keep out," he said. "There aren't many women like your wife." He pulled an old grip from under his bed and began throwing in a few books and clothes. From a drawer he swept a few colored shirts, some underclothes, and a small revolver. "J.K.," I said, "I've been thinking about us, and I think our youth is gone." "What's youth?" asked Joe indifferently. "Youth," I replied, "is the time when you can think anything, feel anything, and go anywhere." "I'm still going anywhere," he remarked. "But you can't think anything," I rejoined. "You say I'm tied to a wife and home. All right, I'm glad I am. But you're tied too. You're tied to a creed, Mr. Syndicalist, a creed so stiff that you can't think of anything else." "All right, I'm glad I am," he echoed. "I'm sorry youth lasted as long as it did." He closed his grip and strapped it. Then he took up his hat and coat and threw a last look about the room where he had lived for a year or more. "Breaking down home ties," he said with a grin. "Don't come to the boat," he added downstairs. "She don't sail for an hour or two, and I'll be asleep in my bunk long before." "All right. Good bye, J.K. Remember, we may meet over there." Again that gruffness came into his voice. "If you do, you'll be taking a mighty big chance," he said. "Good bye, Bill. It's just possible we may never meet again. Glad to have made your acquaintance, kid. Here's wishing you luck." He turned and went off down the farm with that long swinging walk of his, His big heavy shoulders bent rather more than before, and as I stood looking after him I thought of the lonely winding road that he was to travel day and night, in the slums of cities and in and out among the camps. I walked slowly back through the tenements toward the new home among them that Eleanore had made. In the summer's night the city streets were still alive with people. I passed brightly lighted thoroughfares where I saw them in crowds, and I knew that this tide of people flowed endlessly through the hundreds of miles of streets that made up the port of New York. Hurrying, idling, talking and laughing, quarreling, fighting, here stopping to look at displays in shop windows, there pouring into movies, and walking on, going up into their tenement homes to eat and drink, love, breed and sleep, to wake up and come down to another day. So the crowd moved on, while the great harbor surrounding their lives and shaping their lives went on with its changes unheeded. I tried to think of this harbor as being run by this common crowd, of the railroads, mines and factories, of the colleges, hospitals and all institutions of research, and the theaters and concert halls, the picture galleries, all the books, all in the power of the crowd. It will be a long time, I thought. Before it comes, the crowd must change. But they will change, and fast or slow, I belong with them while they're changing. Something Joe had once said came into my mind. They're the ones who get shot down in wars and worked like dogs in time of peace. And I thought of the crowds across the sea, of men being rushed over Europe on trains, or marching along starlit roads, or tramping across meadows. And I thought of long lines of fire at dawn spurting from the mouths of guns, from mountainsides, from out of woods, from trenches in fast blackening fields, and of men in endless multitudes pitching on their faces as the fire mowed them down. And with those men it seemed to me went all the great gods I had known, gods of civilization and peace, the kind God in my mother's church, and the smiling goddess in Paris, the clear-eyed God of efficiency, and the awakening God of the crowd, all plunging into this furnace of war with the men in whose spirits all gods dwell, to shrivel and melt in seething flames, and emerge at last in strange new forms. What would come out of the furnace? I thought of Joe and his comrades going about in towns and camps, speaking low and watching, waiting, hoping to bring a new dawn, a new order, out of this chaotic night. And I heard them say to these governments, "Your civilization is crashing down. For 100 years, in all our strikes and risings, you preached against our violence. You talked of your law and order, your clear, deliberate thinking. In you lay the hope of the world, you said. You were civilization. You were mind and science. In you was all efficiency. In you was art, religion, and you kept the public peace. But now you have broken all your vows. The world's treasures of art are as safe with you as they were in the Dark Ages. Your Prince of Peace you have trampled down, and all your science you have turned to the efficient slaughter of men. In a week of your boasted calmness you have plunged the world into a violence beside which all the bloodshed in our strikes and revolutions seems like a pool beside the sea. And so you have failed, you powers above. Blindly and stupidly you have failed. For you have let loose of violence where you are weak, and we are strong. We are these armies that you have called out. And before we go back to our homes, we shall make sure that these homes of ours shall no more become ashes at your will. For we shall stop this war of yours, and in our minds we shall put away all hatred of our brother men. For us they will be workers all. With them we shall rise and rise again, until at last the world is free." The voice had ceased, and again I was walking by myself along a crowded tenement street. Immigrants from Europe, brothers, sons and fathers of the men now in the camps, kept passing me along the way. As I looked into their faces I saw no hope for Europe there. Such men could take and hold no world. But then I remembered how in the strike, out of just such men as these, I had seen a giant slowly born. Would that proud spirit rise again? Could it be that the time was near when this last and mightiest of the gods would rise and take the world in his hands? At home I found Eleanore asleep. For a time I sat at my desk and made some notes for my writing. I read and smoked for a little, then undressed and went to bed. But still I lay there wide awake, thinking of this home of mine, and of where I might be in a few months more, in this year that no man can see beyond. For all the changes in the world seemed gathering in a cyclone now. I was nearly asleep when I was roused by a thick voice from the harbor. Low in the distance, deep but now rising blast on blast, its waves of sound beat into the city, into millions of ears of sleepers and watchers, the well, the sick and dying, the dead, the lovers, the schemers, the dreamers, the toilers, the spenders and wasters. I shut my eyes and saw the huge liner on which Joe was sailing moving slowly out of its slip. Down at its bottom men shoveling coal to the clang of its gong. On the decks above them hundreds of cabins and suites de luxe, most of them dark and empty now. Bellowing impatiently as it swept out into the stream, it seemed to be saying, "Make way for me. Make way, all you little men. Make way, all you habits and all you institutions, all you little creeds and gods. For I am the start of the voyage, over the ocean to heathen lands. And I am always starting out and always bearing you along. For I am your molder. I am strong. I am a surprise. I am a shock. I am a dazzling passion of hope. I am a grim executioner. I am reality. I am life. I am the book that has